So you may remember that last time I was here we looked at who am I? And we saw that being made in the image of God lays the foundation for what it means to be human. And therefore, it gives us the ability to answer the question, who am I? Now, our main theme this time is to look at Jesus, who is the second Adam and the true image of God. But before we look at Jesus himself, we're going to just start by looking at the sacredness of human life. If you're looking to study the image of God, it wouldn't really be complete if we didn't include murder, in our day, abortion, even marriage, and another thing, dementia. It might be a strange group of things, but we'll just look briefly at those as we go through. Our understanding of each of these areas is founded on each of us being made in the image of God. It's also foundational to understanding why God loves us and would go to such extreme lengths to save us. Jesus' life, his death and his resurrection was for the sake of God's honor and glory, and God demonstrates his honor and glory through his church. That's through men and women who are made in his image, but fallen and sinful, but who are being and will be conformed to the likeness or the image of Jesus. Now, the specialness of man, separating man from the beasts, is found in very clearly, well, it's found in a number of places in Genesis, but it comes to the fore in Genesis 9:6, where it says, "Whoever sheds the blood of a man, by man his blood shall be shed. For God made man in his own image." Human life is sacred. Murder is a very different thing to killing an animal. The reason is not because we have evolved beyond the rest of the animal kingdom. The reason is not because of fairness and equality. Murder is murder because people are made in the image of God. But there's another question when we're thinking about killing humans. When does a new human come into existence? In other words, at what point in our life do we have the image of God? Now, I'm just going to read some Bible passages to you. And in one sense, you'd say, well, none of those passages specifically say when we become in the image of God. You see, the Bible doesn't feel it needs to say that. It's a given. It's so obvious. Well, let's see what these passages say. Here's one in Jeremiah. "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations." In Galatians, Paul says, "He set me apart before I was born and called me by his grace." Exodus 21, "When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out, but there is no harm, the one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him. But he shall pay as the judge determines. But if there is harm, that is to the unborn child, if there is harm, you shall pay life for life." Another very well-known thing from Luke, "For behold, when the sound of your greeting came to my ears, the baby in my womb leapt for joy." Or Judges 13, talking of Samson, "You shall conceive and bear a son. Therefore be careful to drink no wine or strong drink, and eat nothing unclean. For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb." Not from birth, from the womb. So the Bible doesn't specifically say man is made in God's image from conception. It just assumes that. I mean, what else? No one has queried that, really, until the modern age, when we've rejected all concepts as a nation of being made in the image of God. Oh yes, we know as a nation there is something special about humans as opposed to animals, but what have we got? We have just got people who, or animals, somewhat more evolved than others. But humanity is humanity because it is made specially, uniquely in the image of God, and that is from conception. All those verses I quoted are written with the underlying assumption that we are conceived in God's image. I mean, similarly, the Bible doesn't specifically state a man cannot become a woman and a woman cannot become a man. I mean, there's no reason to say that because it's obvious, it's a given. Didn't have to be said. It's unnecessary. The statement God made man, male and female, is enough. Of course it's not down to man to change this. Just because we can't find the verse that says something specific, there are many verses that just show that this is what God means, what God expects. It wasn't necessary. It's so obvious. It hasn't got to be said. And the Bible writers write knowing this to be the case. And they write it, the things they've written, because they know that that's the case. They know that we have the image of God from conception. And a final thought, and I think this is a really, really convincing and helpful one. At what point was Jesus the Son of God? At what point was Jesus as a human the Son of God? Surely it was when the Holy Spirit overshadowed Mary and she conceived. Surely he was the Son of God then in human form. It couldn't have been at any other point. And this is what determines what we believe about abortion. But what about the other end of life? Does a living person who's lost all their faculties still bear the image of God? This is actually, of course, a really important question for me in the job that I do in a nursing home. Almost every resident I visit, possibly every resident, but certainly almost every resident, has dementia to varying degrees. Some of them have no verbal communication. Not to say they can't communicate at all, but I often can't necessarily tell the difference between frustration and joy in the way that they communicate. Dementia is very much a disease of communication rather than taking in. They may take in a whole lot more than they're able to communicate. But you see, sometimes a relative will say, well, that's not my dad anymore, or she isn't the wife that I married. Is it right for someone to say that? If they continue to bear the image of God, then they continue to have the same essential identity and the same value. They are still in the image of God, then they are still the same person. But here's an interesting way to, there's a number of passages I could go to, but I'm just going to go to one, or one thought, an interesting way of addressing the question by asking a slightly different question. Is being made in the image of God limited to this life? You see the point of that question, because if being made in the image of God is also true in the next life, does the person with dementia go from being in the image of God to not being in the image of God to being in the image of God? Of course not. Romans 8:29 says this: those who God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. This is what God is doing in us. And his goal for us is to be in the image of God the Son. In the new heavens and the new earth, people will be like Adam and Eve before the fall, perfectly in God's image, but all unique, just as Adam was different from Eve, but they were both in the image of God. When God created the perfect world before the fall, already, of course, we know, man and woman were created in his image, and that is how heaven will be. So the image of God does not leave us, and for those who believe, we are growing into the image of God until we bear the image perfectly in eternal life, which includes those with advanced or debilitating dementia. I also said that I'd say something about marriage. Human life is sacred because it is in the image of God. But marriage too is sacred. Matthew 19 says this. Jesus says, or he quotes, "So they are no longer two, but one flesh. And therefore what God has joined together, let not man separate." Marriage is one flesh. It's a joining, a creation of God. And this strongly suggests that marriage is also part of the image of God in man. One flesh joined together by God. And it's interesting to note in the Old Testament that the penalty for adultery is the same as the penalty for murder, because it is destroying something made in the image of God. And perhaps this is why marriage is so strongly attacked and with such religious zeal. And as we saw in the last time I was here, Satan loves to damage and destroy the image of God. So there you are. That's some practical outworkings of what it means to be made in the image of God. But it also shows us, does it not, that everything about being human is different. Marriage is different. It's brought together by God. He never says that about frogs making tadpoles. It's not the same. It is uniquely human, being made in the image of God. And so we come to Jesus, the perfect, uncorrupted image of God. Adam and Eve were created in the image of God, and there was no corruption in them. They could walk with God in the garden without shame and without fear. Then they threw it all away. And everyone since that day is born in sinfulness, until one person, until Jesus. Jesus is the second Adam and the true image of God. We've just read, he is the radiance of the glory of God, the exact imprint of his nature, or as the Authorized Version puts it, the express image of his person. The image of God perfectly expressed in human form. It's therefore God's purpose for us to be conformed to the image of his Son, who perfectly expressed the image of God as a human. As I read a moment ago, those who God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. That's the end point for us, to be conformed to the image of his Son. So if I was to ask you, I know the answer. Do you want to be more like Christ? Well, of course you're going to say yes. Absolutely, yes. But what was he actually like? Now, I rather like the National Gallery. The reason is that it's free. And I'm now being that old, I've probably mentioned before, I've got a free bus pass, and so does my wife. So National Gallery is all free, except a coffee. But when you look at pictures of Jesus, he always looks rather solemn, maybe with a far away look in his eyes, or a pious look on his face, and tends to be followed around by a Belisha beacon. halo, you know. And some people probably have a picture of someone serious and dry and pious. But you know, it just fits with the whole picture of what we get of Jesus in the Bible. Do you know there should be paintings too where Jesus is laughing? Or where he puts a brotherly arm around a friend? Or he relaxes with his mates after a good meal? Oh, Jesus did all those things too. Jesus enjoyed a good meal. And in fact, his very first miracle was to make a good party better. Family gathering. He was part of it. It was great to have him there. He was good company. Jesus was a great person to be with, the complete man. His closest friends loved to be with him. It just so happens that we had a men's meeting yesterday morning, breakfast, and it was coincidentally there were 13 of us there. And it occurred to me, in fact, this morning as I was reading through this and thinking about this, 13 people around that table, if we spent any amount of time together, we'd get to know each other really well. Well, Jesus had his 12 disciples, and so there were the 13 of them, and they were spending a lot of time together. Just in that 1 hour, we felt we got to know each other better. Well, what would it be like to spend, a week, a month, a year with those people? That's the sort of number of people that you become really good mates with. Actually, you can't be really good mates with 70, 100 or 1,000. It just doesn't work like that. But you can with a dozen. These guys loved being with him. He was great to be with. If you become more like Jesus, people will love to be with you. They'll look forward to your arrival and they'll be sad when you go. In John 13 ends with Jesus telling his disciples that he's going away and they cannot follow him. They're devastated. They want to come with him. They don't want him to go away. He's not even really told them that he's going to die. He's tried telling them that before and they've really not got it. But they're devastated. No, I'll come with you. I'll stay with you till death. I'll die for you if necessary. They really, really love being with Jesus, don't they? He's a great man to be with. And so it's not surprising that the next chapter starts with those really famous words, "Do not let your hearts be troubled." People who knew Jesus best loved to be with him. They were troubled in heart when they heard he was leaving them. So maybe the best way to answer the question, what was Jesus like, is to ask, what was it about being with Jesus that meant so much to his closest friends? He was protective without being overbearing. So he calmed the storm, but he did let them go into the storm first. He told them off at the end, but he knew that the whole experience was building their faith. And they feared and rejoiced and amazed at what he did. He gave firm correction, but encouraged faithfulness. And we see this, don't we, in Peter? And we had to tell Peter off. But then he also encouraged Peter, didn't he, in his service. He had a sense of humour. You were meant to laugh at the idea of a camel going through the eye of a needle. It's ridiculous. Or taking a plank out of your eye so you can see a speck in someone else's. These were humorous. They were meant to be funny. When the unmerciful servant owed money, it wasn't a few thousands, it was £4 billion. No servant owes their master £4 billion. It's funny. It would make people laugh as they listened and chuckle. When he speaks of the lost sheep and the shepherd going out after one of them, the stereotype of a shepherd, leave all the others behind, go and find the one. It was making a wry comment that would have made people chuckle. He was full of surprises, but always faithful. Outspoken, but trustworthy. I mean, we all know outspoken people who love to say something shocking, but do we trust them? I mean, they may have a way with words, but can we be sure that what they're saying isn't just some flight of fancy? Or maybe they're just trying to attract attention. Jesus said outrageous things. I mean, he called a spade, or he called a whitewashed sepulchre a whitewashed sepulchre. When he saw people who were dead on the inside but looked good on the outside, he said, look, whitewashed sepulchre. He spoke firmly. He was outrageous. And yet he could back up everything and every surprising claim with evidence and integrity. He showed respect, but called out hypocrisy. He shared his plans with his friends and led the way. He spoke with confidence and integrity. He was very inclusive, but never compromising. He was humble, but strong. Think of the washing his disciples' feet. The humility. And then bringing correction. Guess who to? Peter. You know? And then teaching them. This was a great person to be with. He was the full deal, wasn't he? The complete man. He had everything. The people who knew him best were devastated at the thought they might not be with him anymore. And when he gives them that assurance, he says, I'm going to prepare a place for you. Not so that you can have a great time, so you can be with me. That's what they wanted more than anything. To conform to the image of Christ is to be someone who people want to be with. Now, I've read a whole lot of things, said a whole lot of things about what Jesus was like. And I just want to pause just for 30 seconds, and I want you to ask yourself now, is there some characteristic of Jesus that I need to work on? And we're not just, because, I mean, we kind of, it's so easy for us to think, oh, I want to be really good. No, let's be more specific. What are those things? Is any of those that God's saying to you, yeah, I want you to be more like my son in this? Just have a think about that. And if there is something, well, take it away with you. Read what Jesus was like in that. Ask God to conform you to the likeness of his son in that matter. When we have children, we pass on our likeness or image. They're not an identical copy, and my 4 girls are delighted about that. But there is a family likeness. 2 of my girls look a little bit more like me than the others, and another one has the same kind of way of thinking as me. She's the one that when we used to go camping, and she would be at the other end of the tent. It's a bit complicated to put up, and I'd say, I'll put the thing over, and she would just know what I was saying. Nobody else in the world, I don't think, would be able to interpret my mutterings at those moments. But you see, she's got something of the image that I've passed on in her. Some of the way her brain works is so similar to mine that she can sort of read my mind. When God created man, he passed on his image. Luke actually describes Adam as the Son of God. And those who respond to God by imitating him are called sons of God in the Beatitudes. From Adam and Eve onwards, the image of God remains in man, but it is corrupted by the fall. And it's a matter of, if you like, spiritual genetics, that the image is passed on, but so is the corruption. The whole earth is corrupted by sin. And for the Israelites, the people of God, certain things were treated as especially, and they were instructed that they must be treated as especially corrupt. Certain sicknesses and death were very much marks of a corrupted world. And contact with those things would corrupt you. It would make you ceremonially unclean. You'd have to clean yourself and maybe separate yourself from that for a number of days before going into the temple. So when an Israelite touched something unclean, they became unclean. But when Jesus, the perfect image of God, the perfectly clean one, the one with uncorrupted cleanness, touches something unclean, it becomes clean. Do you remember? He said, "Who touched me?" And the woman with internal bleeding, something that would make you unclean, she had become clean because she had had contact with perfect cleanness. The widow's son, Jesus went up, didn't he, and touched the coffin. That would make him unclean. But no, what happens is the unclean person becomes clean. The boy is brought back, or the man is brought back to life. No two humans could ever give birth to a perfect image of God because they are corrupted themselves. But when perfect God overshadows sinful Mary, the resulting child is in the image of God without the corruption of sin. Perfect purity has, if you like, touched unclean flesh, and the result is perfect purity. Romans 8 says that God sent his own son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and Philippians 2 says that he was born in the likeness of men. He looked like a sinful man. He looked like everybody else, so therefore he looked like a sinful human. But he was the perfect human expression of the image of God. Paul says, we read right at the outset, he is the image of the invisible God. The writer of Hebrews says, the express image of God's person. He's the second Adam, the uncorrupted image of God, and his perfection made him the perfect sacrifice. He bore our sins in his body on the cross. 700 years before Jesus came, Isaiah wrote about him. In Isaiah 52, it says this: his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that's marred beyond that of the children of mankind. Christ's disfigurement as he hung on the cross was not just physical. This was how his Father saw him. The image of God, marred, disfigured by all the sin of the world. No one in history has ever been that evil, because he bore not the sins of a few, but the sins of the world. His appearance was so marred, beyond human semblance. It was beyond the marred image of God in humans at that moment. The evil that he took into his body was beyond the disfigured image of God in any other man. And he did this, all this, so that you can be renewed in the image of your Creator. It's our prayer, my prayer, that each of us would be more like Jesus.